God. Where would we channel our excess energy and emotion? No, if there is already no evil in the society. And so we become politically correct individuals. We organize fundraising activities. We support so many charity events so that we can be accused of being apathetic in our society. We can solve the disadvantaged people. But there was also a need for us to show that we're more than just politically correct individuals. Because we were called Generation X. No, and in what was X? No, we're not and so, era came along. Former President Joseph Estrada became the president. And so we have our commandos. In some ways, we thought he was Marcos. He was a governor, he was a womanizer, he was a college dropout, not Marcos. And he has a midnight cabinet. And so, we channeled our emotions in fighting era. We participated in Exodus. That was the first people power facilitated by organized assemblies and by texting. That was the first time that we realized the power of texting. The first time that we realized that text jokes can undermine the presidency. So text jokes against them. Successful. And who was he successful? So we have to Gloria. Those born in the 1990s, many of you born in the 1990s, are like those born in the 1960s. They only knew one person. When Jimmy became president in 2001, they were elected students. Now they are about to graduate from college. There is only one president for them, President Gloria. And there is some attempt of Gloria to be made
through revolution, armed resistance, whether it's through lobbying efforts, whether it's through activism or even joining politics. And even now, he's talking about the current situation in the Philippines, where there's a lot of opposition to the current president. The groups that he was mentioning are still very much, like Anak Bayan and the League of Filipino Students are still very much in the midst of all of that resistance to the current administration. So for us, as an extension of the Filipino people, Filipinos who are outside the Philippines, we also have our own history here. If you look at the history of Filipino migration to Canada, the first huge batch of Filipinos who came they came in the I think mid-60s, no? Or even early 60s. Now, the children of those people, of those Filipinos who migrated here in the 60s, became teenagers, in the mid-80s. And that's when I think we see here in Canada the emergence of a Filipino youth scene, kind of. So right now, I wanna call to the front of the stage our panelists, who I said before were some of the earliest youth leaders in our community. So first we have Roel Sarmago. Roel, if you can come up. And I'm also going to call my buddy Dylan to help me out here. So Roel is a former president of FCAR. So we'll go through all the introductions in So let me just read his bio. Roel is an alumnus of the Filipino-Canadian Association of Ryerson. He started out as a general member in 1993, became sports rep. Who's the current sports rep of FCAR? He's not here. He'll be here tonight. Became sports rep the following year and served as president during the 1995 to 1996 term. He played an active role in the events organized by the United Filipino Students Association, which is, or it was called OFSA, which is the Alliance of the FSAs of Ryerson, York, and U of T. And I'm not sure, well, were there other organizations involved in OFSA, or was it just... Yeah, he'll talk about that later. He was the chairperson of the OFSA Christmas Gala during the 1996-97 term. He was the keynote speaker for the Canadian Awareness of the Filipino Experience Student Conference in 1996 and performer at Super Skills. This year we just finished Super Skills a couple of weeks ago. So he performed in 1997 and 1998. And he was the co-founder and publisher of Brown Sugar, Brown Scene magazine, which ran issues from 1997 to 2002. And Roel was a member of the board of directors of the Philippine Chamber of Commerce in 2007 to 2008. And he is currently a member of the Toronto Board of Trade and the North York Chamber of Commerce. So FCAR can lead you to bigger and better things. The next, so after we'll go through the introductions and then we'll do the presentations. Next speaker after Roel is...
Where's Ramon? Ramon! Get in here now, please. Your intro now, Ramon. He's cool. Okay, let's see. Ramon Grajo is a PhD student in philosophy at U of T. Yeah. His research area is in the method of political economy. He's a student of Philippine society and culture, and he first became active in the early 90s in various Filipino university student orgs, and then in the Philippine Solidarity Movement. He was a co-organizer of the Filipino-Canadian National Youth Consultation of the Philippine-Canada Human Resources Development Program of the Canadian International Development Agency. And he's also a founder of various youth organizations and organizer of migrants, workers, and community organizations, and a human rights advocate. And he has a lot to say, so if you ever wanted to have a deep conversation about all things Filipino, then he's the guy you want to talk to. But anyway, he's here, and he's our second panelist. Is there a third right now, or is it just those two? Oh, okay.
So we have a third panelist who we're very lucky was able to join us today because I told her not too long ago only. But we have, as a third speaker, Nadine Villasin, who is the current artistic director of the Carlos Bolosan Theater Company and is responsible for transitioning the company from a community theater group to a community-based professional theater company. She co-wrote and performed in CBT's Toronto production of Miss Oriented in 2003, as well as Tisri Dunia Theater's Montreal production in 2005, both of which played out to sold-out audiences. Actually, I think I saw the Toronto performance of Miss Oriented. Nadine developed and sometimes performs in Tales from the Flip Side, which is, by the way, happening next weekend. CBT's annual showcase of emerging Filipino-Canadian playwrights and theater artists. And Nadine is one of the co-founders of the Kapisanan Philippine Center for Arts and Culture, located in Kensington Market, and has been instrumental in initiating community events such as the Cultura Filipino Arts Festival, as well as the Flipside Festival.
So here we're going to call up our last but not least, our fourth panelist, Manuel Luis Veneracion. Okay. Hi. Manuel Luis Veneracion is a regular balikbayan, which has returned from the Philippines after being away for a year. During his stay, he was able to travel through various towns and provinces, cultures, and classes from the northern Cordilleras down into Mindanao. Traveling mostly for the heck of it, he also volunteered with the Salinahi Alliance for Children's Concerns and the Children's Rehabilitation Center. He took part in the relief efforts during Typhoon Ondoy, as well as several of their other missions and projects. Manuel will share his experience as a first-time balikbayan, as well as show some video and photos from his trip. Sounds cool. Thanks, man.
We now give the floor to Ruel.
Oh wait, but his
Where do we start? Jeez. I guess I'll give you a sort of a brief bio background. As Minty said, I used to walk these halls back in 1993, I think. 93, 94. Yeah, 1993 was my first year. 1993. I was general member for FCAR back then. And didn't really know what was happening. It was my first year, and I thought, okay, there's some Filipinos who are getting together, and I used to walk by their L374. That was our club room. It was like a big closet in Jorgensen Hall on the 3rd floor. And I used to pass by that office and think there's a bunch of Filipinos laughing and stuff in there. And automatically, because I didn't know them, I thought they were snobby, right? It's funny when you don't really know somebody, you think maybe it's that Filipino mentality that we got to change. But eventually, a family friend of mine walked past her on the street, and she said, "Hey, do you want to be sports rep next year? You want to run for sports rep?" And I said, "Sure, I guess." Okay, who else am I running against? She's like, "No one." And so there was like one person running for sports rep, and that was me. And I was just appointed into the role. And we ran some sports tournaments, and I started getting my feet wet in the whole Filipino scene. And at the time, there were basically we used to have jams, as we call them, parties in Oakham House. There used to be I don't know if it's called the pub down there used to be called the Junkyard way back when. And is it called the Ram now or the Ride? It's called the Ram and the Ride. Yeah, it used to be called the Junkyard way back when. And we had parties down there. But the thing is, and we had sports tournaments like basketball and volleyball sports tournaments, and it was neat for me to see Filipinos getting organized, but there really was nothing Filipino about the events that we did. Oh, you know what, give me a 2-minute warning, because I'm just going to try to get through as much as possible, make sure we have time for other speakers. And so when I was in my second year, they were looking for a president for the next year, I had all these ideas as to what we should be doing, and it's like, yeah, it's great that we're partying together, we get drunk, and we hang out, and we go to sports tournaments, and you know, FCAR's got to beat FSA and U of T, and we gotta win these things, right? So there's all friendly competition, but again, there was nothing Filipino about it. So I ran for president at the end of my second year, became president 1995 to 96 term, and I had 3 mandates. One was to actually make money, because it always seemed like we were spending money and we weren't making any money. Another one was to be more involved with the greater Ryerson community, because the way I saw it was it's almost like organized racism. The Chinese students had their own thing, the Caribbean students had their own thing, and the Spanish students had their own thing, and of course FCAR was the best of them all, right? But so what I wanted to do was actually integrate with the other clubs, and then also actually be more Filipino, because you take the people out of the jams, the parties, the sports tournaments, and it could be any culture. So we actually started injecting more culture into our events. And I achieved all 3 of those things, which was great. And my vice president at the time, some of you might know a gentleman named Len Cervantes. I kind of grouped him for presidency for the next year, and that's the year that Super Skills first started, and we launched something called CAFE, Canadian Awareness of the Filipino Experience, which was kind of like this. It's just like a weird time warp, because it was a small group like this, But from cafe, it just mushroomed into like this huge student conference. And I think at its height, maybe 3 or 4 years later, we had about 300-400 students from all across Southern Ontario, and even people from the States come up. So it's great that you guys are doing this. Keep it going, because humble beginnings, you know, it could grow to something very big. And I've seen it myself. So congratulations to you guys for doing this. Around the same time, kind of like FCAR's, well, we look at it as the golden era, because that was our era. We were very active, and we were like the ones that really had events that everybody just had to attend. And all the other student groups would kind of ride our coattails, and it just made it stronger. It's not like we were conceited about it, but we're like, you know what, we've got a good following. Why don't you guys just join us, and we'll just all have parties and fun together and have these huge tournaments together. And so the resurgence of something called UFSA came around, which was the United Filipino Students Association. It started off with the Christmas Gala, probably in the late 80s. There was a formal Christmas dinner, and it was a partnership between U of T, St. George campus, and FSA. And they just called it the Filipino Christmas Gala. And they thought, okay, well, we need another organization name. Like, Filipinos always need to make it a name for their organizations for some reason. So they call it the Bi-University Filipino Association or something. And then Ryerson got on board. There's the Tri-University Filipino Christmas Gala. And then by the early 90s, it was called Waterloo came into it. And they were called the Quad University. So it's going to be a little ridiculous. So we needed an umbrella name that could have as many members as possible. So then we came up with something called the United Filipino Students Association, which was not supposed to be an organization on its own, but it was just an umbrella sort of name to organize people, organize all the different member organizations, so that we could all do stuff together. And I think that's kind of like where you guys are right now. You're starting to communicate with the Filipino student groups at U of T and FSA again. And, you know, I think that's a really good thing, because there's much more strength in numbers. Anything you guys want to do, there's much more that you can do when there's more people, of course, right? And perhaps another time, I would love to come back and get into more details about what we actually did and how much fun we had, so that you guys can hear more of the stories. But in essence, for this talk, I'll move on. Cafe ended up going on for about 5 years, and it got bigger and bigger, to the point, like I mentioned, we had about 300 or so attendees at Western, at Wolf, was what it was called. I think it's still called Wolf. They hosted it there, and we all went up there. There was about 300 people. And then Len and I were at the end of one of the cafe conferences. We were suffering from cafe conference fever. We're like, yeah, we're going to change the world, you know, Filipino awareness, you know, and all that sort of thing. But we were leaving school. We were just about, I was a year ahead of Len, and we were wondering, how can we keep doing this? Because we love what we did. And another friend of ours, by the name of Romeo Candido Jr., he was kind of like the shit disturber of the group, and he kind of still is. Great guy. He came up to us and said, hey, how about we start a magazine? And then we ran with that idea, and found, well, Len could write. He's now a senior producer at MTV Canada, which I think you'll hear from him this afternoon. We had another friend who went to George Brown for graphic design. And my course here, my program was graphic communications management, which is basically the business of print. So we had a writer, graphic designer, and we had a publisher. Yeah, let's run a magazine. But the thing is, what we didn't know is how to make money. And so we went through a few years of test, trial, and error. Actually, I'll tell a really quick story, and then I'll end it off here. The way we launched it is actually kind of neat. For about 2 years, we tried to launch this magazine, and we had all these great stories. We had writers, we had people who could come up with awesome designs, magazine layouts and stuff, and I knew how to put it all together. All we had to do was put it into a computer and hit print, but we needed to print like a few thousand copies. The problem was we didn't have money to print that. So we racked our brains for several months, for about a year and a half. How are we going to do this? So another friend of ours who was a creative director at an advertising agency, on a little note, really keep the contacts that you have today, because you never know when you can help somebody else out or they can help you. Because I kept a Filipino contact from high school, saw him in university, and then afterwards he came around and said, well, what is it that you guys can do well? And Len and I looked at each other and we're like, well, we know how to throw parties. At one time, is the cafeteria still called the Halohalo? Yeah. One time we packed that place with probably about 700 people. I think the capacity was only like 350 or something like that. But we packed the place, and it was a partnership between a few different student organizations. So we knew how to throw parties. So my friend Noel, who's the art director at an advertising agency, he said, why don't you guys throw a launch party? Again, there was the spark, and then Len and I put our heads together and we're like, yeah, we know how to spin things, we know how to hype things up so much that it's almost a white lie at the beginning, but after the fact it actually came true. So we said we were going to launch a magazine. Even though we didn't have a physical magazine in hand, we said we were going to launch this new Filipino-Canadian magazine. And Len was working at Sullivan Entertainment at the time, which produced some well-known Canadian hits as Anne of Green Gables, Road to Avonlea, like really boring stuff, right? So he was working there. I was working at Now Magazine. Yeah, word up. Now Magazine, just down the street. So we were in our careers. And so we decided to launch this magazine. We did a whole PR campaign. We negotiated the use of this venue for free. Again, our negotiating skills of what we learned at FCAR. We negotiated to use this venue down at, where was it? Duncan and Richmond Street, I think it was. Right at the corner there. The venue's not the same anymore, but we got the use of that place and we said, we'll bring in tons of people. You guys will make money off of the bar. We're going to bring in, we basically didn't have any proof, but I sold it to the guy and said, we can bring in like 500-600 people easily. We're launching this magazine, blah, blah, blah. You have people on the bar. Just let us keep the money at the door and coat check. And that's how we were going to make the money to launch the magazine. And so we said, yeah, sure, do that. So we ran this PR campaign. We ended up having CBC Radio show up. Now Magazine showed up. iMagazine showed up. We had a bunch of different ones. And then the night of, we didn't really know if people were going to show up or not. We just knew we could throw parties. And so the first few people started, and there was also a Filipino modeling agency that was starting up at the same time. So we had beautiful people wearing brown sugar t-shirts. And they were like the party hosts. And so it was, when did we launch it? I think it was like in February we launched it. So it was a cold day, a cold evening, and people started trickling in. They paid their cover at the door. It was like, we charged $7 before a certain time and only $10 after like 11 o'clock. And we charged like $2 at coat check. So first people started trickling in, and more, and then we actually did pack the place. We didn't quite hit our quota at the bar, but the guy he had overshot what we had to make at the bar anyway, so he was still impressed the fact that we made so much at the bar. And so he let us off the hook. We didn't have to pay anything. But we had about $2,000 from the door in coat check that we made. And people were asking, where's this magazine? And all we had were like billboards printed up, largely like billboards on easels and stuff like that. We said, we don't have the magazine here. We want you guys to go out and actually purchase them from our retailers to show them that there's a demand. Like, oh wow, that's really smart. Little did they know, we didn't even have the money to print. Like, wow, that's really smart. Okay, cool. So that's the cover of the magazine. We had the whole thing ready. It was on a disc and ready to print. So that was on a Saturday night. Monday morning, I ran to the printer and got these things printed and said, okay, here's the money, here's the disc, now print. And then we got them out to the venues. Actually, we got them to the venues late. The retailers were pretty late. So when I called up one of the retailers and said, I'm the publisher of a magazine, I spoke to somebody else there before and I want to bring our magazine and put it on the shelf. I said, what magazine is it? I said, it's Brown Sugar magazine. And then the guy on the other line said, oh, you're the guy. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, what's the big idea of telling everybody that your magazine's going to be here? And we had no idea what they're talking about. I go, really? So there was a demand? It's like, yeah, there's about 10, 15 people every day for the last week asking where this magazine was. I'm like, oh, cool, okay, well, I'll be right down. So dropped it down there, and that was our first issue. So we did 2 issues of Brown Sugar. That was the time when the internet was just taking off, and our domain name, our website address was www.interlog.com/BSMag. Brownsugar.com was actually a porn site. And we're like, no big deal, brownsugar.com. So then we realized we had to change the name, so we changed it to brownstein.com. We bought that domain name, and that's what we published as. And we had published about 13 or so issues after that. And then, well, fortunately we weren't making enough money off of it. We had to let it lie. And then that's when Lem started his path on being an executive senior producer of something bigwig at MTV Canada. And now I'm at Investors Group. I'm a division director there. And the company's sending me to Tokyo at the end of May, so I'm doing well. One last little plug is if there's anybody who's entrepreneurial, get in contact with me or get in contact with Roland, who's got my contacts. And I'd be happy to forward your resume to other people or something like that and just keep the continuity going. But I'll stick around for a little bit longer if you guys have any questions. Thanks.
I was asked by Niti to speak, but she didn't tell me the time frame, so she just gave me this 10 to 12. So I have 2 hours. Just kidding. I'm gonna keep it shorter than that. So I've shortened it to 1 hour and 45 minutes. Anyway, I've been asked to speak about the historical role that Filipino youths have played in the community here in Canada. I think the reason why I was asked is because I'm the oldest one here, and I sort of saw it from the very beginning, or near the very beginning. And if I hadn't been involved in that and gotten married early, probably my kid would be here with you guys now. So I won't reveal all of that, but you can do the arithmetic. But it was around the late 1980s. And I say this because it depends on the area of Canada, right? So in some cities it started in the late 80s, some in the early 90s, but there was a flowering of different kinds of student associations, both university associations and student activist groups. So I don't know whether it was in the water or in the air, but they were all popping up, and there were 3 kinds of questions that were in their mind at that time, if you look at their activities. One of them was the perennial question of identity. You know, what it was to be a Filipino, what did that mean, etc., etc. And I think maybe this arose because this was probably the first generation of Filipino kids who grew up in Canada or who migrated here, not as adults, but now we're, getting into their 19, 20 and stuff like that. So they would ask themselves these questions, whereas their parents had been migrants and really didn't ask that question, but were so busy trying to get established that they didn't really pass down. Because in the beginning, there were a large number of Filipinos. That really took off in the 90s. And I just vaguely remember at one point, there were some areas of Toronto where you could see lots of Filipinos, and then at some point it seemed you could see them everywhere. So that it was somewhere around the 90s where it was growing from the 70s on, but that's when it really became noticeable. So I guess that was the time. And the second one was the question of unity. There's always, this problem, and I think it's still a perennial problem, that there's so many Filipino groups, right? But they seem to be divided amongst themselves. And so this was a question amongst university-age kids talking about, how can we try and build some unities amongst youth and students? And the last one was this question about solidarity, right? Are we just going to be a youth organization where we just hang out and do sports or parties or something like that, or is there something more that we could do? So a lot of these youth, there are different levels of the way people ask these questions, but at the forefront were a lot of youth who started to go back and study Philippine history, etc., etc. So some youth activist groups were set up, and they were closely tied with the regular universities, Filipino ethnic student associations and things like that. Often they were members of that who became activists, so that was kind of the relationship. And they were kind of the workhorses for a lot of the solidarity movements here. In a sense, you could say it was youth and what we would say in the Philippines, gayo, because that's the old people. Because the people who had recruited them into solidarity work were ex-student activists, right? They were activists in the 70s who had come here because of martial law or the economic crisis. And so it was just a meeting of people who were youth activists and people who were now youth activists. And this is the time when the first question about, more than unity in the cities, right? But even the question about, can we speak of a Filipino-Canadian youth movement across Canada? And that's why we managed to trick PCHRD, which was a program of CIDA. I don't know if you know CIDA, but it's the Foreign Aid section of International Affairs. We managed to trick them when they were in a vulnerable point because they had been exposed as funding warlords in Negros in the Philippines. And so now they set up this PCHRD program, and it was supposed to promote human resource development. And so we tricked them into funding a Canada-wide youth consultation. That's the language we had. It's the language you got to use when you're talking to government, right? Or government agencies, youth consultation. And we held it in Quebec, in this town outside of Montreal. Marco was there. He's an Alpha youth like me. And so there were youth from BC, from Vancouver, all the way to the Atlantic provinces, Filipino youth and Filipino Canadian youth, and they talked about questions about the divide amongst Filipino youth between those who grew up here and those who were newcomers. Right? There were, linguistic differences, cultural differences, and things like that. They talked about their need to identify, what it was to be Filipino to them, and the problems in Philippine society. And so they actually set up a program of action there that is actually the root for talking about the activities of Filipino youths and its consequences afterwards. Right? So there was talk about setting up cultural groups, getting active in all sorts of people's movements. And that made it, because it was done locally, but in terms of Canada-wide, right? And that went on for that period. And the result of it was in the late 90s to the early 2000s, there was a very vibrant Filipino youth movement, both the Filipino student associations. You just heard what was happening. So these were the outgrowths of that. From this initial, Canada-wide conference to the various cultural and political conferences and events that came afterwards, like Cafe or UFSA. And many of these people who came out of that, right, either went into the cultural industries or set up cultural groups or became organizers and set up various people's organizations that are now active in our community. For example, workers' organizations. If you've been reading the Philippine reporting, there's been campaigns, for example, recently on domestic workers issue because a significant minority of Filipinos here went through the various forms of these foreign worker programs. And these were set up by these Filipino youth originally. Plus work in the unions, etc., etc. And so the period between the late 90s to the early 2000s, and you can see the fruit of all this. We're, you know, from that sort of the later part, earlier to that later part of that generation. And we can say that here are the three, how much time am I at? Because I'm trying to keep this short. 2 minutes, okay. Here are the three main contributions that happened out of there. The first one was the creation of a people's movement, right? Because the first Filipinos who were here active in political activities were either in those political exiles, I think, for example, your mother, right? The anti-Marxist dictatorship, and the solidarity movements after that, and human rights movement. But it was all people who were activists in the Philippines, and it was the entry of the youth that turned it into a broad people's movement, because it was these youth that went out and became organizers for various organizations in the Filipino community. The second thing was in reinvigorating and putting to the forefront the importance of Philippine identity and culture. You're probably too young to remember this, but you know, when I was growing up, that wasn't the question, right? People were trying to integrate, and they thought that meant that you wouldn't tell your kids anything about the Philippines. They wouldn't even learn how to speak Filipino or anything like that, right? And some of you still went through that experience, especially if you were from a smaller town or something like that. And you almost kind of hid that you were Filipino to outsiders. I mean, you'd have Filipino parties, right? Everyone might remember this, you know, all of your relatives or clan members or from people from the same village or town or barangay. But it was at this time where it became propagated that we had to be proud of what being Filipino was and what it did mean. And it was looking back at Philippine history to the people's history of the Philippines, right? So now everyone says, you know, they're proud to be Filipino, even people who probably aren't, right? So it's a product that it's on the agenda. That's the important thing, right? It's on the agenda. The third thing was Philippine studies actually became a legitimate field. I can't say it was just due to Filipino-Canadian youth. It was also due to Filipino-American youth, because it was around the same time they had links with each other and actual organizational contacts with each other. So now you have this advantage that you can actually take courses on the Philippines if you're in university, right? I'm actually part of a collective of academics called Critical Colectivo, which are various academics from various departments that are engaged in Philippine studies. So I'm in the Department of Philosophy, some people are in OISI, that's in education, some are in sociology, etc., etc. So while there were Philippine academics before, there weren't that many of them. And they weren't necessarily focused on Philippine issues, because I knew some of them were like in chemistry, right? Even though the one I knew, she was active in the Philippines as a student activist. I mean, her PhD was in chemistry, and she didn't really talk about the Philippines. But now there's something like that, and it's a legitimate field. Even non-Filipinos are involved in it. Like the head of the geography department in New York University, he's been doing studies on migration, right? So these are the three things, right? These are three important things that my generation, your generation, we're sort of in the river, that combined generation, made possible. Now, why I'm saying, putting it this way, is because there was a kind of era of the dark years of the Philippine students movement in the mid-2000s. And I call it the dark years for the following reasons. For one thing, while there used to be this organic link between Filipino activist youth and their organizations and the basic Filipino youth organizations like university associations or community associations, that was kind of severed. For a while, the Filipino activist youth weren't really involved, and the other way like that. So I'm happy to see that it's coming back, that links, right? You're seeing, like, for this event, if you look at the groups that are sponsoring this, there's basic Filipino organizations like the Student Association, right? that its requirement is you're just a Filipino and a student, so that's why I call it basic. And the other one is you have to be active in a certain way, so it's an activist organization. And the second thing was, in the early years when Filipino youth went to the community to organize Filipino workers' organizations or domestic workers' organizations, they didn't tell these people what to do. They went there to listen, to learn from them, to find out what their realities were. And somewhere around the mid-2000s, instead of independent Filipino youth activist groups who were organically linked to Filipino basic organizations, they started to be linked with NGOs, these institutes, centers, non-government organizations. And they were now preaching or telling workers what they're supposed to do, or what. So there was an alienation there, right? Happily, there's been a revival since the late 2000s, and it depends on which city, what year exactly, that there's going back to the old ways or the new, or the ways it was always been done in Philippine history to create a popular movement. So that's sort of the history, and those are the accomplishments. And so this, again, if you look at it, there are really three challenges to Filipino youth throughout our history. The question is, the first one is, what is it to be Filipino in youth? And it's not just a question for you if you grew up here, it's a question even in the Philippines, right? What is it to be Filipino? Because there's the ruling elites preach a different message from the people's movement, right? And that's completely two antithetical views of what it is to be Filipino. And the second one is the question of unity. How can the Filipino youth make themselves a factor, a positive factor in Philippine society? Right? What kind of, there's a saying that the youth are the future. I mean, let's make it less trite, right? What future do you want to make, right? Do you want to make the Philippines better off and the Filipino people abroad better off? Or are you those people who want to disappear into the general population, right? So that's the second question, right? And the third one is related to that is for what and for whom, right? So I'd like to summarize it as like history, unity, and service to the people. The first one thing about history is it's very important. This is always a contested question. Sorry, this is for the academic sounding thing. And that is to study our history in the present situation, right? How can you know what it is to be Filipino if you don't know the history of the Filipino people, right? And what the problems and challenges it faces, right? Two, what is the relationship between activist youth groups and basic Filipino youth organizations? Right? If you look at it, there's this historical cycle involving both groups, types of groups. For example, in basic youth groups, this is how it tends to happen. And to an extent, FCAR sort of slightly bucked it, but it's generally followed the trend. What happens is groups come, these are a bunch of friends, really want to do something, and they set up a youth university organization. They're all really active, right? Or if it pre-exists, they really reactivate it, and they're their friends, and so and so. And they graduate, and then it sort of dies down. There's phases like that, right? And you also have a kind of phase like that in activist youth groups, where you get a surge of youth activism, and they're really active, and then it dies down. It turns out there's actually a connection between them, right? The historical memory of groups really comes from those who were really active and were engaged in things. Because if your group is just for basketball games or party or it could be any association, it has no historical memory, right? You have to go beyond that. And they positively feed off each other, right? A lot of the activist students came from the regular basic youth groups, and the basic regular youth tend to have an historical memory because of these activist youth groups, right? So it's important of both of them. This is a question about unity, that they have a connection. And the last one is service to the people. And I can say the lesson here is you have to go deep amongst the people and investigate their problems, right? And so that when you organize their organizations, it's for them and you develop their leadership. And so you're not sort of a servant of some NGO or something like that. So I think that's the history of the youth movement here, in Filipino-Canadian youth movement here, the lessons that you can draw from it. So, sorry for taking too much time.
Hi. So, as Missy said, I'm the artistic director of the Carlos Bulosan Theater. I would consider myself, and the community of artists that I work with would also consider themselves, I think, cultural activists. I was raised by activists. I'll start by telling you a little bit about the history of the theater company. It was originally founded, my mother was one of the co-founders, and it was originally founded as the Carlos Bulosan Cultural Workshop. And it was the cultural wing of a political organization. So it was founded by the Coalition Against the Marcos Dictatorship. And it was thought that an important way of engaging the community and educating the community could potentially be through theater. So CBT is actually the longest standing Filipino theater company. It was a community theater group at a time when community in theater was a dirty word. So even though we're now a professional theater company, we still refer to ourselves as being community-based because we don't think that community is a bad word. Essentially, I mean, over the years, CBT has done plays about issues that affect the Filipino community. So the inaugural play was about the experiences of an immigrant in Canada dealing with the political situation back in the Philippines. And since then, CBT has done plays about domestic violence, about caregivers, about generation gap. And when I became involved, I grew up in CBT, or CBCW at the time, but when I became involved in 2001, when the original leadership was ready to kind of step down and pass it on to the next generation, one of the things that I felt was really important was, you know, now, I don't know how many of you know this, maybe all of you know this, but we're not just the third largest immigrant community in Toronto, we're the third largest immigrant community across Canada. And despite being very sizable communities, we are underrepresented in theater, in entertainment, in the media. And growing up in Canada, I felt a real absence of a reflection of my experience, my history, in classroom, on stage, on television. So for me, one of the most important things when I became the artistic director was to talk about, I really wanted to talk about, to give voice to my generation and the experiences of my generation. So the first play that we did was about identity, was about cultural hyphenation and identity. And since then we've gone on, we've been doing history plays because that's what's interesting to me and I think and important, particularly for first, second generation Filipino Canadians who don't know a lot about their history and who experience cultural shame because of racism. I mean, I think the real purpose of our theater company is to give voice to our history, to our experiences. We do, I think, for me, youth engagement also became very important. We helped co-found the Kamalayan Filipino Center for Arts and Culture, which kind of has a broader mandate of you know, not just theater arts, but visual art, music, well, all different kinds of art form grounded in Philippine culture and identity. What can I say? We have a play creation program that is about nurturing and developing new Filipino-Canadian playwrights. And inevitably, I mean, inevitably, we don't control what people are going to write about, but inevitably, each year, we've been doing this for 9 years now, and inevitably, year after year, new playwrights always want to talk about, there's always a play about identity, there's always a play about racism, homophobia, because these are the things that we're experiencing in our community. What else can I say? I mean, I know I can speak for my generation. You know, I grew up at a time when, despite the fact that I grew up amongst activists who were very active in the community, I felt very disconnected from the community. I couldn't relate to a lot of the community events that were happening that identified being Filipino with, you know, dancing the tinikling and Halohalo, although those are good things. But for me, I think it didn't necessarily encompass the Filipino experience, the Filipino-Canadian experience. I couldn't relate to it. So I think that it was really important to me to have a place that was a hub for not only Filipino-Canadian artists, but Filipino-Canadians who are interested in knowing more about their culture, a place to come together, a place to identify and feel proud about being Filipino that wasn't just about food or wasn't just about a social activity. I don't know what else to say beyond the fact that I think when I was coming up, and we talked about this with Roel and Romeo, when we were coming up as artists, we didn't have mentors. We were kind of making it up as we go. And I think that's what we're trying to provide for the next generation, is mentorship. And I think it's no accident that in the past decade, like when I first started the theater company, I could maybe think of 5 people that I could get to come act or direct or to do something with the theater company. And now the community of theater artists and artists in general has just exploded, and I think that that's no accident. I think that in being able to see your experiences reflected in theater, in film, in art, it inspires others to do the same. And so that's what we aim to do, and I think that's all I have to say for now.
I find it very funny that I'm amongst a really accomplished panel, because all I really did was go to the Philippines and come back. But I am also, I can say maybe fruits of their labor. I used to go to cafe events and perform at Super Skills, and a bunch of my ex-girlfriends I probably met there. People power was one of those things that got me involved with Kapisanan after I watched that. And I hope I don't make you feel old. Like, yeah. So like I grew up within that system, going to all those parties that some of your associations were putting on back in the 90s and early 2000s. Anyway, so I'm Manuel. I didn't even finish school, so it's funny that I'm speaking at a student organization. But so I guess I should give you a little bit of my history. So I was born in the Philippines. I came here when I was 6 months old. So I was really pulled away from home. And I guess growing up, I grew up like in a Balik land. We spoke English in the house, blah, blah, blah. And we never went back. I only went back when I was 10 years old for like 2 weeks. And when I went back last year, no, 2008 in October, I went for a year. And the reason I just bought a one-way ticket. I quit my job, saved a bunch of money, quit my job, and just left. And the reason why I did that was because I had never been to the Philippines as an adult. I knew nothing about it. And it was just something aching inside of me. I don't know what to call it. Curiosity, sense of adventure. I read like crazy Kerouac books and then like, you know, motorcycle diaries and stuff like that. So it was just my frame of mind, and it was just the right time to go, so I left. And I ended up staying a year. My plan was like to travel the world, but I ended up staying in the Philippines because once I got there, I realized, man, I hadn't been here my whole life, and it's home. And so every other month, I'd be like, okay, maybe I should go to Malaysia or somewhere else. And I just kept staying because there's so much more to learn and experience. So anyway, I have a few videos and stuff from my travels. And I'll show you. So, okay. Yeah, I left in October last year. And the first 2 months, all I did was stay with my family. And that was because I was scared. Like, I don't know if any other Filipinos here, like, their parents tell you, oh, the mosquitoes are this big, and don't talk English to anybody, they're gonna kidnap you, and like, don't go to Mindanao, there are crazy people there, and, you know, just a whole lot of filling your head with, like, what is this place that I'm going to, right? Like, I'm from here? I don't know. So, I kept some journals, and this is basically when I got there, this is where I was at when I arrived. It's pretty much how this works. Oh my gosh. City in Mindanao. You should always bring Chanel's in your backpack wherever you're going.
Yes, 6 or 5 times a week.
years old. And he's just talking about the major ones, and he's talking about himself and where he was originated from his heritage.
May challenge ba Mindanao na yan? Tapos sorry. Ganda doon.
He's talking about where he's from. Tawi Tawi is a really hard place to come up, and that was where he's from. So yeah, the women are separate from the men in mosques. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of videos of us in Mindanao. I don't want to show you all of them, but basically after that, I got what you call the lakas ng loob ko. I was like, I'll go anywhere after that. So JR left me in Cebu somewhere, and I just started going to see the country for myself. And it was great because it smashed all the myths that my parents and grandparents gave me. And like we were talking about Filipino identity and stuff like that, and like I'm starting to realize the importance of why I went there. It's big because I get to come back and tell people about it, and we can talk about Filipino identity here, and I hear it a lot. We always talk about it. It's a big thing with Torontonian Filipinos, but it's for me. It's like you have to go there. You have to experience yourself. You can't just, you can talk about it